Welcome to the 3D parametric conveyor belt system. The conveyor belt, as I'll show you in this example here, this is the demo scene that comes with the package, demonstrates how you can move objects. Now, we have a capsule here, which is a player controller, the character controller built in Unity, and it has a custom script so that I can move it around. And then there's a rigid body box over there that just gets dragged around with the conveyor belt. You can see the conveyor belt is moving objects in the direction it's moving. There's a scroll bar here. You can scrub right and left and change the speed of the conveyor belt. And you can see it moves smoothly with the change of speed here. So I'll go ahead and show you how you can create a conveyor belt quickly. So right-clicking in the hierarchy or going to the game object dropdown and going to 3D object, and then conveyor belt pops a new conveyor belt into your scene. I'm going to call this conveyor belt blue. And you can see it there. I'm going to go to the scene window so we have a better view of this. I'll move this down towards the ground here. And you can see that there's a solid green box surrounding the conveyor belt. Now that box is the trigger box. And you can see I can go into my conveyor belt, select it into the conveyor belt component here, and go to the bottom, and there's a debug gizmos checkbox here, show gizmos checkbox. You can turn that on or off, and it will show you what's called the trigger object. And we'll get into that in a second. For now, I'm just going to turn down the opacity on that trigger object. Okay, so you can see the conveyor belt is purple or pink. That means that it doesn't have a material assigned. Now I've gone ahead and created a material, but you can make your own materials here. In the package, there are two textures, conveyor belt 1024 and 1024 normal. So it's just the conveyor belt texture and the texture normals. But you can feel free to make whatever texture you want and whatever material you want. So I'm going to drag in this blue material into the conveyor belt material slot here, and it's automatically going to assign it to the conveyor belt. I'll go ahead and turn off the gizmo so that we can see it. So now you can see it's kind of small. So if I wanted it to be about the size of one of those, I can come up here to the profile shape in the conveyor belt component, and I can change the length. I think that's about 15. So maybe that's actually about 20. Let's go on this. And you can make it any size you want. Now there's also a feature so you can change the height of your conveyor belt, like tire tread or something. But here, the height allows you to get more of a curve or an arch on the sides there. So if you have big rollers under your conveyor belt, you could certainly change the height of your conveyor belt. And then we've got the width under extrusion. Now the corner segments are how smooth this angle here is on the end. So I can set them all the way up to 20, or I can bring it down to 1. And at 1, it's a corner. It's a box, basically. Segments and the corner segments allows you to get either a really low poly model if you need, or zoom the poly count up so you can have more defined mesh if you need. So the material slot. Now UV scale, this will scale the texture that you have assigned. So in this case, if we wanted really small panels here, we can increase the U scale. If for some reason you wanted to also duplicate the V scale, you can do that. I recommend using the U scale here and not changing the scale on the texture or material itself. If you modify the tiling on the material, then you will lose some of that 1-to-1 ratio that you get with the conveyor belt moving objects across at different speeds. Even the scroll speed is the speed at which the conveyor belt will move. So this can be positive or negative, and it changes the direction and the speed. And now if I turn debug back on, and let me just make this box a lot more transparent. If I turn debug back on and I change the scroll speed, you'll notice back here, let me actually turn around here. There's a yellow line with a circle on the end there. And that yellow line denotes the direction of your conveyor belt and the speed. So the farther out it goes, clearly the faster this conveyor belt is moving. The next setting is to start conveyor belt on play. So if you want it to be stopped when you hit play, and then maybe some action that the player takes starts the conveyor belt, maybe there's a button they have to press, I would leave this unchecked and then have that button call the play or start method on the conveyor belt system. And you can certainly do that through events. So you can have a Unity event that ties into the public start method here on this conveyor belt if you want. All right, so next is a scroll curve, and this scroll curve allows you to adjust the way that the conveyor belt plays. So I've got it set to this diagonal curve. All right, so you can see it moves and then it stops, moves and then it stops. Now moving down, we have the audio section, and the audio section has a start sound. So if you want a sound to play when the conveyor belt starts up, and then a running sound while it's running, and finally a stop sound when the conveyor belt stops. And these fire off with the start and stop methods that you have to call. Just changing the speed in the conveyor belt system will not change the, will not fire off the start and stop events. Okay, then we get the trigger movement. So this just defines a trigger box that the conveyor belt system has. So you can see there's a trigger box. It's this green box here, and that's different than the collider box, which I believe is a mesh collider. So it's the mesh of the conveyor belt is what the player's colliding with. But this trigger box is a box that detects when something interacts with the conveyor belt. If the trigger box is not tall enough, then nothing will collide with it and nothing will move. So you want to make sure that this is a little higher or taller than the conveyor belt so that objects will set off the trigger and get pushed in the conveyor belt. And you can also turn off move objects and trigger. So if you didn't want something moving for some reason, and you probably also want to make your trigger box a little bit longer than your actual conveyor belt. So if there's a nice curve on the end and your object starts moving off the end but then gets pushed out of the conveyor belt trigger box before it falls off the conveyor belt, that often happens because the trigger box doesn't push it fully off of the conveyor belt. So if you make it just a little bit longer on both sides than the conveyor belt itself, then it will push objects completely out of its visual mesh. Okay, then we have events. You've got a start and a stop event. Again, you can add fields here and then fire off other actions on start and stop. So maybe you have an object that instantiates boxes and drops them onto the conveyor belt, and maybe you only want those to start when the conveyor belt itself starts. So maybe the player runs up to a button, presses it, conveyor belt starts moving, the object that's dropping the boxes also starts dropping boxes onto the conveyor belt. You can do that by adding events here, and you won't have to code anything. You just need to link up your objects in here. Okay, and then finally debug, which we've gone over before. Just shows the gizmo and the speed of your conveyor. And actually, finally, we have a start and stop button here, which these also simulate the start and stop methods in the class. They're public start and stop methods that you can call to start and stop the conveyor belts. So if you hit stop, it just stops it from moving. Doesn't matter how fast you set this speed to, it won't move until you hit start. So stop and start.